Mike Trent, good morning, everybody. Chris Goodhand, Northern Powergrid. I'm looking after the SIF program. So this is Diversified Flexible Queue Management. It's a project between ourselves, WSP, and NG ESO. The next slide, please. Okay, next slide again, please. And the next slide again, please. Okay, so a little introduction to the problem. We all know that we need to meet net zero, and the clock is ticking, not very long to go. In order to do that, we need to produce much more renewable electricity if we're ever going to meet the increased demand that transport and heat will place upon us. And now to do this, we need to be able to connect more generation and more demand to the network. And to do that, that requires available network capacity. Once that capacity is all used up, we have to build more capacity, and that takes some considerable time to do. You're into relatively major civil engineering to do that. So if we've got a system where there's not a lot of available capacity, is there a way perhaps of looking at the types of generation demand that we have attached to our system in order to try and squeeze a bit more capacity out and make better use of what we've already got in the existing network, whilst we get on with building the additional capacity. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so if we look at what we traditionally do when we're actually looking at capacity and looking at generation connected at a particular point, we will have a look at the generation that's to be connected. We will make an assumption that everything connected will provide its maximum output at any particular moment. And once we've added all that up to the available capacity, we'll regard that location as full and at no further capacity actually available. However, if we can have the next slide, the real world is not actually like that, is it? We know that the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, and if you've got a battery, you can back it off. You don't necessarily have to actually be using its output at any particular time. So if we start to consider this diversity between the generation types, is there some more capacity that we can actually squeeze out of the system, is the question we've been looking to answer. You know, we think that's probably the case. We've considered diversity forever in our design of the LV system, so it's not a concept that we are unfamiliar with, but we are into a slightly new game. So if I can have the next slide. So if we consider all this diversity and then say, well, okay, how is the real world behavior of the generation likely to be? And we start to look at that, we expect that there might be some available capacity that we can use to connect additional generation while we actually get on with building more network to actually support the longer term view. And this project is all about exploring how we might do that, what issues we have, how we can dynamically manage the connection queue at any particular point, how we can regard the generation that's actually there and its inherent characteristics in order to exploit that diversity in order to see if we have more available capacity. So that's the problem. So Mazza and Laura have been working very hard to actually answer some of those questions. So I will pass it over to them to tell you how they've got on with that.
Thanks very much, Chris. If we can go to the next slide, please. Another one. So just a brief introduction. I'm Mazhar Syed. I'm an associate power systems consultant at WSP, and I was leading the work package 1 of this particular project. So the objective of this project were delivered through 3 work packages. The first work package looked at defining the problem and quantifying the problem at hand. The second work package looked at the regulatory barriers and any opportunities that we might have. The outcomes of each of these work packages, 1 and 2, directly fit into development of use cases and high-level benefit analysis in work package 3. If we can go to the next slide, please. As part of work package 1, we developed and verified 2 hypotheses. So the first one was that the actual available capacity at a GSP is much higher than what we currently consider as available. So this is by means of considering dynamic headroom that is available at GSP. The second one was that this dynamic headroom, this actual available capacity at the GSP, can be effectively utilized if we consider the diversity of the generation mix. So if you have a suitable composition of generation mix, then this dynamic headroom can be effectively utilized. In order to do this, we screened 40 GSPs within the NPG license area, and we quantified the dynamic headroom at each of these GSPs. We relied upon publicly available data to undertake our analysis from 2019 and 2022. Just a snapshot of this analysis is presented in the right-hand bottom corner graph. If you can go to the next slide, please. As part of work package 2, we reviewed all the various policies, network initiatives, and regulations that are available out there for connections queue management across the distribution and transmission. Some of them are presented on the screen just now, which included NGSO 5-point plan, the tech amnesty, access SCR, and SQSS. If you go to the next slide, please. At the same time, it was very important for us to engage with stakeholders to understand their point of view and their thoughts on the current existing connections queue management. And also to understand what would be the change or what would be their thoughts if we bring in this diversified flexible queue management. So we set out to identify a few stakeholders and assess their inputs based on the likely interest and influence over the outcomes of this work. We developed a questionnaire which was passed on to our stakeholders, and then we also arranged 30-minute interviews with each of these stakeholders to gather their feedback. We've had good sessions over the past couple of weeks, which is now directly feeding into our work in work package 3. If we go to the next slide, please. So the outcomes of work package 1 and work package 2 have now allowed us to prioritize 8 GSPs for further evaluation. Now we are working towards developing use cases and demonstrating the high-level benefits that can be acquired when we incorporate the diversified flexible queue management. Moving forward, we will be taking wider network constraints into consideration as well. This work is still ongoing and is expected to finish next week. The next slide, please. So coming over here, right at the beginning of the project, we had set forth some hypotheses that we knew we had a feeling that by utilizing the diversity of generation and load within the network, we could enhance the hosting capacity. So through the work that we've done so far, we've been able to verify this hypothesis, and now are optimistic and excited to be proceeding to the next stage, that is the alpha stage, to develop the proof of concept. Now we are working towards refining our objectives and work plan for the alpha phase. That'll be end of my section, and I'll now hand over to Laura.
Thanks, Mazza. If we move to the next slide. So good morning, my name is Laura Brown and I'm the Commercial Manager for Flexibility Services in Northern Powergrid's System Flexibility team. So thank you for your interest in this project, and I'd just like to briefly summarise our further discovery phase dissemination plans. Next slide, please. So we have 3 routes in addition to the show and tell today. We're going to deliver a more comprehensive show and tell session and make that available online. There'll be outcomes posted through our media channels, and we'll be preparing a paper for the IET Future Power Systems Conference later in the year. Next slide, please. And I'll quickly go through the conclusions to leave some time for questions. So the next slide, what we've found in this study is that just what we thought, that the discovery phase has shown some really promising connection timescale benefits from taking diversification into consideration for both generation and demand. So the next steps that we're going to evaluate through in the Alpha project is verification of these assumptions and models using real-world network and customer asset data, and we're going to establish the cost benefits to both the network and to our customers' connections, what the benefit of that, getting them on quicker, is going to be to their business models as well. And we're going to refine the methodology for incorporating diversification of resources for unlocking more dynamic headroom. That's me. So the next slide is just a thank you from us for your attention and an open opportunity for you to ask questions. Thanks.
Super. Thank you so much, Laura, Mazer, and Chris. Yeah, great presentation and really exciting project. I think looking at kind of unlocking diversity of supply and flexibility for accelerating connections. So I think there's a couple of questions. I'll maybe start with that, and then I have a few questions as well. I think there's a clarification question maybe to you, Mazer, which is, can you please explain how the diversity factors are calculated and maybe just outline some of the key assumptions made when you're calculating that, please?
At this stage, we have had to make some assumptions in terms of calculation or the consideration of diversity factors that we've used, and it varies. So, for example, for the demand itself, we've used what is typically used, what is found in literature for distribution networks, which was around 0.65 to 0.7. So this was the assumption that we've used for the demand. Now, in terms of the generation that we've used, what we've done is we've used location-specific data for solar and wind. So what is the solar radiation at that point? What is the wind profile at that point? And we've incorporated this into our analysis as well. So this has informed us of the results that we presented today. But moving forward, as we said, so we still need to verify the assumptions that we've undertaken. We still need to verify the models that we've used. And this is what we plan to do in the next phase of the project, the alpha phase.
Thank you, Mr.
Also worth saying that an awful lot of academic and industry work has gone on to work out what these diversity factors ought to be. So there are a sort of set of industry rule of thumb numbers that we're actually using. I think as we look at the next phase, the alpha or beta phase, while I think we will probably spend some time looking at what those diversity factors are, I can't see us doing anything like the large amount of work that's already been done in this particular area.
Great, thanks, Chris. The diversity factors have attracted a lot of attention in terms of questions, I think. So, do the diversity factors depend on asset health? Is it a function of asset health, Mazer, when you're looking at? Do you know if the literature has kind of looked at asset health as well in correlation?
Yes, definitely. I mean, and this is a very good question. But for our preliminary analysis, we haven't considered the asset health. But moving forward, again, this is another factor that should be taken into consideration to try to understand what would be the impact of asset health on unlocking this sort of dynamic flexibility that we will have at the GSP.
Thank you. Moving on, I guess another question on diversity factors. Do these factors depending on historical data? So, for example, do you look at generation profiles over time, or is it more a point-in-time analysis?
Well, it's a great indicator. So that's what we've done. So we've used the historical data that was available to understand what the diversity factor was. But again, it does vary from year to year. But utilizing this data, we would be able to perhaps predict better diversity factors moving forward. So yes, it is a good indicator.
I'd like to add, Manu, it's always obviously that it's very dependent upon the availability of the renewable resource, for example. So some areas may have different diversity factors based on their available resources. So I think there will be a key element of this study is utilizing the data sets that we have for regional and national pictures when it comes to available resources.
Got it. So I guess that's one of the complexity in your project that you perhaps need to validate going forward, is that it's a function of many different things. I think it's got a spatial element, it's got a time element, it's got a asset health element, which I guess at the moment you've kind of relied on kind of good literature to look at. But yeah, as you said, the focus of alpha is perhaps kind of ground truthing some of that going. Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. Got a few more minutes.
It's a complicated, just on that, Manu, it's a complicated issue. You're quite right. You can start to take, temporal issues, locational issues, all these things into account. But if we're not careful, we embark on a research project which has some very interesting academic outcomes, but what it actually doesn't do is solve the actual day-to-day problems that we've actually got. So, we will build on what has gone before. We will probably incorporate reasonable safety factors into that. We will then verify that that is a reasonable approach, because what we're involved here in trying to do is to get more people connected faster. So it's very easy to go down a rabbit hole with these things. So we just need to keep reminding ourselves that we are, in this particular case, we are engineers and we are not the scientists in this one. So it's very easy to get distracted if we're not careful, and we are very keen not to do that.
I think it's a great reminder, Chris, to not lose focus on going into some of these academic rabbit holes. So I'm with you on that. So as I say, a few more minutes. Maybe the one question I had kind of linked to this was, have you kind of found from your analysis in terms of what you need to understand from the asset to take some of these calls, is there any of this information missing from the field at the moment where we perhaps need additional monitoring to kind of cover some of the gaps? Yeah, have you kind of done that gap analysis?
Yes. I mean, for example, as I said, we were relying on publicly available data, and the data that we had was at GSP point, so metering point at a GSP. But this was sort of an aggregate data set, which was a sum of the loads and generations within that particular area. Now, in order to understand and do our analysis, we've had to make some assumptions and then sort of start to separate out this total power flow into different profiles. If we had data or more granular data of the generation and load within the distribution network, then our analysis would be more accurate. But still, I think that's why moving forward is to trying to get real world data, getting data from asset owners, and then incorporating that into our methodology to make it more accurate.
Brilliant. And I think that's a good point actually for people participating in it. Perhaps if you're kind of renewable development operators or companies, etc., I think perhaps a good opportunity to kind of share data for this. I have a couple more questions, maybe looking forward a little bit. It might be hard to kind of answer this point, but it might be interesting to just pick up, which is how might the cost of this kind of unlocked network capacity compare to traditional reinforcements? I know there's a whole complexity around the methodology around kind of doing that, but maybe keeping that aside for a second, do you have a kind of sense of scale?
Yeah, I think there's two elements here. There's we're doing this to help with connection speed, if you like, so to help put connections on the system ahead of reinforcement works. So it's more a speed thing rather than a cost. So the cost benefit of that is that the customer's connected sooner and has started their business model ahead of the original prediction. So that's the real benefit. From a cost of traditional reinforcement, it's not apples with apples, I think, if that's fair to say, because this is really just looking at the queue management and making the decision of what of the available capacity we have, how is the mix of generation and demand types we've got on there, and then some real-time data of what the network's actually doing at particular points. Can we make some more intelligent decisions about? I know the word Chris used was squeeze, but I don't want to scare anyone. That it would still be a very safety-driven decision about putting on new capacity, but it's just about managing that capacity once it's on board to make sure that safety and resilience isn't impacted.
Got it. So I think we're just going to run out of time. Maybe just on that, a follow-on question, Laura. That's going to be my next question. Can you give the audience a sense of how much faster this process can be? Because you have a good sense of how much reinforcement takes. Can you just tell us how quicker this can be?
Well, at the moment, because we've been focusing on the GSPs, because that's our longest timescales for connection at the moment, where we've got connections that require some transmission upgrade work as well. And due to the works in our area, sometimes that can be 10 years or more for a connection time slot. based on the volume of connection applications we've got at the moment. So we're hoping that it brings people ahead of that 10-year wait. So that's the sort of timescales. There'll still be a number of years, perhaps, just to work through the queue. So I'm definitely not going to give you a date or an increase, but we're hoping to really move down from this waiting for a decade to a more traditional sort of connection queue timescale, if that makes sense.